Uncle Rick caught me when I saw him with Mrs. Thompson in our garage. This will be our man's secret, he said, but I didn't know what I was getting into. I was looking for my bike pump that afternoon when I heard strange sounds coming from our garage. The door was slightly open, and curiosity got the better of me. What I saw made my stomach drop. Uncle Rick was there with Mrs. Thompson from next door, and they definitely weren't talking about borrowing sugar. They were pressed against my dad's workbench, completely lost in each other. I must have made a sound because Uncle Rick's head snapped up and our eyes met. The panic in his face was immediate and terrifying. Mrs. Thompson quickly straightened her clothes and slipped out the back door without even looking at me. I stood there frozen, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. Uncle Rick walked over to me slowly, his face a mixture of embarrassment and something else I couldn't quite identify. He put his hand on my shoulder and squeezed a little too tight. He told me that what I saw was complicated adult stuff, and that it would really hurt a lot of people if anyone found out. He said men sometimes had to keep difficult secrets, and now I was old enough to understand that. He made it sound like some kind of honor, like he was trusting me with something important. I was 14 and had no idea how to process what I'd witnessed. All I could think about was Aunt Sarah's kind face and how she always remembered my birthday with homemade cookies. The thought of her finding out and being hurt made me feel sick. Uncle Rick seemed to sense my confusion and pressed his advantage, explaining that sometimes protecting people meant keeping quiet about things that might hurt them. Looking back, I realized how manipulative that conversation was, but at the time, it felt like he was treating me like an adult for the first time. I agreed to keep the secret, thinking I was doing the right thing by protecting everyone involved. Date 1. What started as a simple agreement to keep quiet quickly became something much more complicated. Uncle Rick began using our shared secret as leverage for small favors. He'd ask me to cover for him when he was late to family dinners, telling my parents he was helping me with homework when he was actually nowhere to be found. He'd have me run errands for him, always with a knowing look and a reminder about how good I was at keeping secrets. The worst part was when he started bringing Mrs. Thompson to our house when my parents were at work. He'd text me to make sure I was at school, but sometimes I'd come home early and find them there. The first time it happened, I walked into my own kitchen to find them drinking coffee like nothing was wrong. Uncle Rick just smiled and reminded me about our agreement while Mrs. Thompson avoided eye contact entirely. I started feeling like I was living a double life. At family gatherings, I'd watch Aunt Sarah laugh at Uncle Rick's jokes and bring him his favorite foods, completely oblivious to what I knew. She'd ruffle my hair and ask about school while I struggled to look her in the eye. The guilt was eating me alive, but I'd made a promise, and breaking it felt like betraying everyone at once. My grades started slipping because I couldn't concentrate. I'd lie awake at night wondering if I should tell someone, but Uncle Rick had made it clear that revealing the secret would destroy the family. He'd remind me regularly how much it would hurt Aunt Sarah, how it would break up their marriage, how it would cause problems between my parents and theirs. The weight of that responsibility felt enormous. The secret started affecting my relationship with my parents too. They'd ask why I seemed distant or why I was spending less time at home, but I couldn't explain without revealing everything. I felt isolated and trapped, carrying this burden that felt too heavy for someone my age. Update 2. Things took an unexpected turn when I overheard a phone conversation between my mom and her sister. They were talking about Aunt Sarah, and my mom mentioned how worried she was because Aunt Sarah seemed so sad lately. My mom wondered if everything was okay in her marriage, and that's when I realized the secret might not be as well hidden as Uncle Rick thought. I started paying more attention to Aunt Sarah during family visits, and I noticed things I'd missed before. She'd get this distant look when Uncle Rick was on his phone, and she'd make little comments about how he was working late so often. There were moments when she'd catch me looking at her, and I'd see something in her eyes that made me wonder if she knew more than she was letting on. The breaking point came when Uncle Rick asked me to lie directly to Aunt Sarah's face. She called looking for him one evening when he was supposed to be at our house helping my dad with a project. Uncle Rick had actually gone out with Mrs. Thompson, but he'd told my parents he couldn't make it because he wasn't feeling well. When Aunt Sarah called worried about him, Uncle Rick gestured for me to cover for him. I found myself telling Aunt Sarah that Uncle Rick was in the bathroom and couldn't come to the phone, watching her face fall with disappointment. She thanked me and hung up, but something in her voice made me realize she didn't believe me. That night, I couldn't sleep knowing I'd looked someone who cared about me in the eye and lied to protect someone who was hurting her. The guilt became unbearable. I started avoiding family gatherings, making excuses to stay home or go to friends' houses. My parents were concerned about my behavior, but I couldn't explain what was wrong without breaking my promise. I felt like I was drowning in this secret, and Uncle Rick's casual attitude about the whole situation made it even worse. Then something happened that changed everything. I was walking home from school when I saw Aunt Sarah sitting in her car outside Mrs. Thompson's house. She wasn't doing anything, just sitting there staring at the house. When she saw me, she rolled down her window and asked if I wanted a ride home. The car ride was quiet, but there was something in the air between us that felt heavy with unspoken knowledge. Update 3. The revelation came in the most unexpected way. I was helping Aunt Sarah clean out her basement when she found an old photo album. As we looked through pictures of family gatherings and holidays, she stopped at a photo of Uncle Rick and made a comment about how he'd been different lately. She said it casually, but then she looked at me directly and said she knew things had been hard for me too. My heart started racing because I thought she was about to confront me about the secret. Instead, she told me something that completely shattered my understanding of the situation. She said she'd known about Uncle Rick's affair for over a year, but she'd been too scared to do anything about it. She was afraid of being alone, afraid of starting over, afraid of what people would think. I sat there in complete shock as she explained how she'd noticed the signs months before I ever saw anything in the garage. She'd found receipts for places they'd never been together, noticed how he'd changed his schedule, caught him in small lies that added up to something bigger. She'd even seen him with Mrs. Thompson once, but she'd convinced herself she was imagining things. The most shocking part was when she told me she knew that I knew. She'd seen how uncomfortable I'd become around her, how I'd started avoiding family gatherings, how I'd get that guilty look whenever Uncle Rick was mentioned. She said she'd been waiting for me to say something, but when I didn't, she realized I was probably scared too. We sat in that basement surrounded by old family memories, and she apologized to me. She said she was sorry that I'd been carrying this burden alone. Sorry that Uncle Rick had put me in an impossible position. Sorry that she hadn't been brave enough to address the situation herself. She explained that she'd been hoping the affair would end on its own, that Uncle Rick would realize what he was risking and come back to their marriage. But the biggest shock was yet to come. Aunt Sarah told me that Uncle Rick had been using my silence as justification for continuing the affair. He told her during one of their few confrontations about his behavior that even I knew what was going on and didn't think it was worth making a big deal about. He twisted my reluctant silence into some kind of approval, making it seem like if a kid could handle the situation maturely, then maybe it wasn't as bad as she thought. I felt sick realizing how Uncle Rick had manipulated both of us. He'd used my desire to protect Aunt Sarah to keep me quiet, and then he'd used my quietness to make Aunt Sarah feel like she was overreacting. We'd both been trapped in this web of silence that only benefited him. Final update. The conversation with Aunt Sarah changed everything, but not in the way I expected. Instead of immediately confronting Uncle Rick or filing for divorce, she asked me to help her with something completely different. She wanted to plan her escape carefully and quietly, and she needed someone she could trust to help her prepare. Over the next few months, Aunt Sarah began secretly organizing her life for independence. She started taking computer classes at the community center, telling Uncle Rick she was doing volunteer work. She opened her own bank account and began saving money from her household budget. She even started looking at apartments, though she was careful to do her research when Uncle Rick wasn't around. I became her unofficial assistant in this process, helping her research things online and providing cover stories when needed. It felt strange to be keeping another secret, but this time it felt different. Instead of protecting something shameful, I was helping someone prepare to protect herself. The most surprising development was watching Aunt Sarah transform during this time. The sad, distant woman I'd grown used to seeing started showing glimpses of someone stronger and more determined. She'd always been kind, but now there was a steel in her spine that I'd never noticed before. She started speaking up more at family gatherings, expressing opinions she'd previously kept to herself. Uncle Rick seemed oblivious to the changes happening right under his nose. He continued his affair with Mrs. Thompson, continued making excuses for his absences, continued treating both Aunt Sarah and me like we were too naive to understand what was really going on. His arrogance would ultimately be his downfall. The end came not with a dramatic confrontation but with a simple conversation. Aunt Sarah had secured a job, found an apartment, and opened her own credit cards. She'd quietly moved her most important possessions to a storage unit and had everything ready for her departure. Then she sat Uncle Rick down and told him she was leaving. She didn't accuse him of anything or demand explanations. She simply said she deserved better than a marriage where she felt invisible and unimportant. She told him she knew about Mrs. Thompson, but that the affair wasn't even the main issue anymore. The real problem was that she'd lost herself trying to hold together a relationship with someone who'd already checked out. Uncle Rick was stunned. He'd been so confident in his ability to manage the situation that he'd never considered the possibility that Aunt Sarah might take action on her own. He tried to convince her to stay, promised to end things with Mrs. Thompson, even suggested marriage counseling. But Aunt Sarah had already moved past the point where those solutions would work. The family was shocked when Aunt Sarah moved out, but she handled their questions with grace and dignity. She didn't air Uncle Rick's dirty laundry or try to turn people against him. She simply said they'd grown apart and that she needed to focus on her own happiness for a while. Some family members suspected there was more to the story, but Aunt Sarah's composed handling of the situation actually earned her more respect than drama would have. Uncle Rick's affair with Mrs. Thompson ended shortly after Aunt Sarah left. Without the thrill of secrecy and the complicated dynamics of his marriage to navigate, their relationship lost its appeal. Mrs. Thompson started avoiding him, and Uncle Rick found himself alone with the consequences of his choices. The most unexpected outcome was how this experience affected my relationship with my parents. Watching Aunt Sarah's courage in changing her life inspired me to be more honest about my own struggles. I didn't tell them about the secret I'd carried, but I did start communicating better about other things that were bothering me. Our relationship improved as I learned that honesty usually led to support rather than punishment. Looking back, I realized that Uncle Rick's manipulation had taught me some valuable lessons about the difference between protecting someone and enabling bad behavior. Aunt Sarah's decision to take control of her own life showed me that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is refuse to participate in someone else's destructive patterns. The last time I saw Uncle Rick, he seemed smaller somehow, diminished by the consequences of his actions. He'd lost his wife, his affair partner, and the respect of his family. He'd also lost the power he'd held over me through that shared secret. I no longer felt bound by our agreement because I understood that it had never been about protecting anyone except himself. Aunt Sarah thrived in her new life. She discovered talents and interests she'd forgotten she had, made new friends, and eventually started dating someone who treated her with the respect she deserved. She never remarried, but she often said she was happier alone than she'd been in years of marriage. The whole experience taught me that secrets have power only as long as people agree to keep them. Once I understood how Uncle Rick had used my silence to justify his actions, the secret lost its hold over me. I learned that protecting someone sometimes means refusing to enable their destructive behavior, even when they try to convince you that silence is kindness. Most importantly, I learned that courage isn't always about dramatic gestures or confrontations. Sometimes it's about quietly preparing to change your life, taking small steps toward independence, and refusing to accept less than you deserve. Aunt Sarah's quiet strength taught me more about integrity than any dramatic revelation could have. The garage where it all started was eventually cleaned out and converted into a workshop where my dad and I work on projects together. Sometimes I think about that afternoon when I stumbled upon Uncle Rick's secret and how different things might have been if I'd handled it differently. But I've come to believe that everything happened the way it needed to, and that sometimes the most important lessons come from the most uncomfortable situations.